Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session today. My name is Katherine and I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. It's a pleasure to see you all, and thank you so much for joining us. A big thank you also to those of you participating online. It's great that you can join us virtually. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, chairing this session after 2 long years working from home during the pandemic. Today, we will be discussing the role of local government for enabling decarbonisation, both directly and as an enabler for other sectors. We have 3 speakers who are involved in this work and who have very generously agreed to share their thoughts and experiences. So I'd like to quickly introduce our panel speakers. We have Dr. Katy Roelich, Associate Professor from the Faculty of Environment at the University of Leeds, Karl, Co-founder and Director of Abundance Investment, and Joseph Holmes, Executive Director from West Berkshire Council, and he is joining us online today. So the structure for today's session is that each speaker will be given 15 minutes to provide us with a presentation, and then I'd like to open up a 20-minute discussion where you're warmly invited to ask questions from our panel. If you could kindly wait until after all the speakers have presented to ask your questions, then that would be much appreciated. Or because we're using the Glisser platform today, please feel free to pop your questions in the question and answer form, and I'll try my very best to get through them. If you're on Twitter, please do feel free to tweet about the session and the wider conference using the hashtag UKirk22 and at UKirkHQ. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Katy Roelich.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, on the wrong side. Hello, welcome. It's very exciting to see actual people. I'm going to be talking from a slightly different perspective about the role of local government, and I'm going to be particularly focusing on how they make decisions and how that affects the role they have, because I think there's a very broad role they could have, but my argument is going to be that that role is very tightly constrained by the processes by which they make decisions. So bear with me on this argument. I'm going to start with a horrendously complex slide because it's a horrendously complex situation. So I'm going to focus on transport today just because taking the whole of decarbonisation is a bit much. I think other speakers are talking about other parts of decarbonisation. So I'm just going to use transport as an example. And what I'm trying to show here is just the extreme complexity of trying to decarbonise transport. So we've got the different sectors of transport. We've got highways, cycling, the way that ticketing's done, buses, light rail, trams, communication with people. So we've got lots of different places in the system we could intervene, and they all interact with each other, so they are not mutually exclusive. So you've got complexity just in what the interventions are. So if a local authority a local government was thinking of intervening to decarbonise, the system itself is quite complex. Then if we think about who's involved, we've got a vast array of actors, from sort of national government to local authorities, combined authorities. So just from government actors, there's a lot of complexity. And they all have different ways of doing things, different values and different aims and objectives. And then in transport, as with other sectors of decarbonisation, we have the private sector as well. So they're involved, particularly around the sort of the franchising of bus infrastructure and light rail, but also in relation to infrastructure as well. So we've got a completely different sector outside interacting with the different parts of the system. And then we have what I've sort of loosely grouped as users, but us, people that use transport, and we make our own decisions in different ways, and we interact with these systems in different ways. So we've got complex systems, loads of people, and then into that, in order to make the interventions, we need funding, and that comes from lots of different sources. So it might, for transport, come from national government, from local government, so local taxes, and also some private investment. So you've got the inputs are very varied. And you've got these people trying to rationalise those different forms of funding, and they're all trying to achieve slightly different things of outcomes, or multiple things around not just decarbonisation, but a lot of intervention will also address things like congestion, the health effects of poor transport systems, or the health benefits of good transport systems. Some of them might want to be making income, or they might want to be making revenue. And also, because transport changes places so much by dividing them or by making them a good or a bad place to be, there's a real sort of outcome of transport can really affect what it's like to be in a place, a sense of place. So you can sort of imagine why, when you see this complexity, it's very difficult to know what to do. We're not just trying to achieve decarbonisation, we have possibilities of other things. We're not trying to achieve, there's not one person trying to achieve those things, there's lots of people. And we've got a very sort of fragmented funding situation that we're desperately trying to match with the things we need to do and the outcomes. So, complex slide, complex situation. So if we think about the challenges facing local government when they're trying to do that, across all those different elements of that system, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. We don't know how much funding there's going to be. We don't know what conditions it's going to come with. We don't know what the users, people using transport, are going to want or need or do. So people might change jobs, housing patterns might change, people might change their perspectives and their ability to use different forms of transport. So there's huge uncertainty around that. Because of the complexity of the system, we don't really know what building a cycle lane will do. We don't know. There's no automatic improvement in cycling just as a result of building a cycling lane. So the effectiveness of interventions, particularly given the complexity of that system, can be quite difficult. We're not acting alone, so it might be that bus providers are doing one thing, we're trying to do another thing with ticketing, or it might be that one part of the transport system is doing one thing which affects the sort of the potential for cyclists to do something. So there's real sort of uncertainty about how other parts of the system are going to change. And of course, transport is very connected to other systems, so the energy system, the planning system. So all those things are changing at the same time as transport, which fuels a huge amount of uncertainty. And one of the key things that came out on that slide is that it's not one actor trying to change this system. There's lots of people acting in different ways, and the responsibility is divided, but also the benefits accrue to different people. So you might, as a local government, do something for transport, but it might reduce the health costs, but you'd have to pay for it. So the sort of spread of benefits, it can be quite challenging. And also, just because it's a complex system, it's really hard to know when things have changed, so to measure system change. So if you put one bike lane in, do you know that we've passed a tipping point and cycling, how much the sort of system has changed, that we're moving away from car dominance towards a more sort of active travel system? So this is why it's hard to make decisions, basically. This is why it says, well, just here's a pot of money, decide what to do. It's very, very hard to actually decide what to do. So it's very hard to justify, because local government has to justify what the benefit of investment is going to be. There's sort of a duty to the public purse to justify intervention. So it's quite hard to do that, given all these conditions. And that tends to mean that because of all the uncertainty, because of this division of responsibility and benefits, the role of the local government can get really constrained because of this uncertainty and having to justify intervention. And also just because of the way they make decisions, it can just really limit this. Greg Marsden did some really interesting work through the pandemic, where there was a massive opportunity to rethink transport, to really shift towards public transport. All the bike lanes that had spun up had really sort of tipped it. We'd got used to not travelling as much, working remotely. But he found that policymakers just didn't have the decision-making tools to progress with that, to make that transformative change. So they just reverted back to the same sort of activities they'd done pre-pandemic. So it showed that their ability to change is really limited by their ability to make decisions. So what I'm arguing is that we need different ways of enabling the local authorities to make decisions to better enable decarbonisation, so that they can take into account uncertainty, and so that they can take into account the sort of the multi-actor element of this process. So that's the work that I've been doing. Sheridan's here doing it with me, and I've got a large project funded at the moment looking at decision making, particularly in transport at the moment. So I'm just going to run through a couple of things that we're doing, the two elements, one on the uncertainty side and one on the multiple actor side, to look at how we might improve decision-making processes. The first is around tackling the uncertainty side of things, and COVID, the pandemic, clearly threw up real challenges around, particularly the demand for transport, and presented a real opportunity to try different ways of making decisions. And all through the pandemic and through the lockdowns, we were working with a local transport authority to try and help them use scenario planning just as a way of accounting for the uncertainty. So COVID was an extreme example of the uncertainty, but a lot of those uncertainties are there already. It just forced the local transport authority to think more carefully about them. The uncertainty became much more apparent to them. So the sort of broad approach of scenario planning is that you explore plausible futures. So you take all the different elements of uncertainty and think of, well, what's the range of things that might happen. You identify interventions that are effective across those range of futures, so you don't have to think about, well, we don't know which futures might occur, so therefore we don't know what to do. You think about interventions that are effective across a range of futures. And also you can plan in flexibility, so if things pan out differently to those futures or how you expect, you can build in sort of places to switch and change and build in flexibility. So we were working with the local transport authority to try and embed this in their decision making. And they were enormously successful in some senses. It really shaped what they thought they could do, and a lot of the plausible futures showed that actually the biggest sources of uncertainty were what funding was coming, what other people were doing, national government. So opened up a new area of decarbonisation activity, which was to lobby central government to make sure that funding came more smoothly, and that the funding for public transport was better. But it sort of hit the buffers, particularly when the urgency of COVID reduced. And there was a lot of sort of points of tension. So this is where it sort of indicates that things need to change. It's not just having the right tool, it's having the right environment in which to make decisions. So local government tends to rely very much on cost-benefit analysis type of decision making, which requires you to quantify the cost, quantify the benefits, and find the best solution based on those things. And that's incredibly difficult to do in the face of uncertainty. So people tend to retreat to the sort of the most certain objects, and more innovation tends to get missed out of those. Or it's hard to justify something that has some of the wider benefits around health, congestion, because things like time savings are much easier to quantify than some of those things. So it's sort of, that doesn't fit with the sort of uncertainty management, is that it doesn't allow you to take into account a range of different outcomes or a range of different benefits. So there's just this sort of history of how we make decisions, stopping people dealing with uncertainty appropriately. In line with that is generally there was a need for a firm number to say, well, if you're going to get us to spend our limited budget on this project, you need to give us a number. And that's quite an end to this sort of this institutional environment of risk aversion, of false certainty. And that just sort of stops using these alternative methods, so really thinking about that. A lot of the people we were working with are quite new to futures methods, and generally there's not a good literacy with futures methods. There's a lot of sort of hearsay and myth around it. There's not really a great deal of understanding of what the methods are doing and how to do them. So there was a real challenge needed there. And also, given the sort of the range of plausible futures that are likely, given the extent of uncertainty there is in transport, having a very limited range of people developing or implementing the work can limit the range of futures, and so actually leave open a lot of uncertainty. So one thing that really needed to be addressed was the sort of the range of people that were involved in developing futures and then looking at solutions. And that is problematic because a lot of local government is quite nervous of opening up these contentious issues to participation. So even though we do need a broad range of views, because of the range of uncertainties, there's a real hesitancy and a real nervousness around participation. So it was, there are tools and methods for managing uncertainty in these complex systems, but there's a lot of blockers in local government to actually implementing those methods. So real challenges around doing that. The other side of talking about is this real fragmented responsibility, the fact that we have people responsible for very different parts of the system, and they may not necessarily have the same goals, and also they may not have the same decision-making processes. So what might come out as being beneficial for one actor might not come out for another. And they might not align with decarbonisation. So, you know, particularly the involvement of the private sector, or the focus on transport and the goals of increasing, reducing congestion, rather, might not necessarily align with decarbonisation. And particularly around, as we saw in the previous slide around uncertainty, there's a real culture and context of self-sufficiency and a real lack of resource available to work with other actors and to do this sort of cross-actor working, and the sort of the resource to just build partnerships that is necessary for this complex system. So the sort of the culture and the context can really limit that. Not all actors have agency to act on the sectors they need to, so just because of the way it's fragmented, it might be that local authorities don't have control over things that they know will have the most impact in their sector. So thinking about, it's not just what's the thing to do, it's do I have any agency over that? That can be a real contrast there. And then again, because the systems are so connected that you can't anticipate what another actor is going to be doing. If you're acting in isolation, you can't understand what the intervention of one actor is doing, because that might affect what you're doing. So, for example, if the bus operators are going to completely change their routes, it doesn't matter what you do on ticketing, routes aren't going in the right place, and you can't really anticipate that. So there's some real sort of interaction challenges there. So this is a much earlier piece of work. We're about to start looking in more detail at a particular case and the benefits of interacting. But based on some earlier work in a slightly different sector, and some work looking at the application of sort of multi-actor methods, and to some extent on the scenario planning work, there's a real need to think about organisational dynamics. So really think about how people interact within an organisation, because it's quite often different parts of an organisation that need to speak to each other. We might have one group working on rail, one group working on bus, one group working on cycling, and they might have completely different dynamics and cultures, even within an organisation. And then you take into the fact we've got multiple other organisations. So there's a real need to recognise those dynamics. Really thinking about not just the sort of the outcome, but that organisations, those actors, might have particular values and processes and agency, and thinking about how we might align them better with decarbonisation. And really thinking about, because of those things, the dynamics and the sort of the structure and values, there might be things we need to do to build the relationships, build the stakeholders, align values better with each other before we can even do things. And that can be very difficult to get funded. So there's sometimes precursor things that need to happen to enable, and this is where the sort of second part of the title of this session around enabling others to do it. There's a lot of work around that mobilising that might need to be done. So just concluding there, it's not that local authorities don't want to act on these things. It's got the sort of extreme uncertainty and fragmented responsibility means it's incredibly difficult to just decide what is the best thing to do in this very complex circumstance. And we don't necessarily have the tools available for them to do that. We're very stuck in sort of decision-making approaches which aren't appropriate to the complex context that we're in. And there are useful tools and approaches that can use to address that, but they don't necessarily fit in with the decision-making processes that are there. The organisational and institutional dynamics aren't necessarily well aligned with those processes and challenges. The values and agency might not be aligned with the processes or decarbonisation. And participation can be quite a contentious issue, even though we recognise the benefits, it can still be sort of risky and frightening for local government to do. So there's a lot to be done on the context around how decisions are made, not just about importing tools into the decision. And that needs to be done broadly to enable local authorities to do more on decarbonisation. So we have got more work coming in this space, but I'll leave you with that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Katy. You started your presentation saying that it's a horrendously complex slide because it's a complex situation, and I think that you really articulated that very well in terms of decarbonising transport. So now we have Karl Harder from Abundance Investment.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk from a sort of slightly different perspective. We're a practitioner. Oh, my head. Yeah, I'm in scope now. Yes, so we're a crowdfunding platform, which is an electronic platform website which allows people to come together to fund net zero infrastructure. We're what's called an investment crowdfunding platform, so we're regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority because we're raising money that has a sort of financial return on it. So people are investing, they're lending money to projects and expecting that money to come back with interest. So we do work sort of with the private sector where we fund companies delivering net zero infrastructure, wind turbines, tidal projects, green social housing. But we also work with councils, and that's the reason we're here today. And the work with councils has come out of a really interesting sort of collaboration. It's funded by central government in a project called Financing for Society about 4 years ago now. It was 2018, so different world. And working with the University of Leeds, and then some sort of pilot councils, pioneering councils who wanted to look at new ways to engage their residents in what they were doing and also raise money to back their decarbonisation plans. So that resulted in a concept which is called local climate bonds, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through the presentation. So just sort of principles behind Abundance, what we're about is making things accessible. So we have this very low minimum investment, which is £5. When we set up 12 years ago, we were the first crowdfunding platform to set up in the UK. We went and spoke to people and they said, £5, you're going to get people to invest, but that's impossible. We demonstrated it wasn't impossible, and you didn't need to have £10,000 to actually use your money to make something happen in your community. We've also allowed people to use their ISA and pension to put their money to work. But the heart of Abundance is about sort of rebuilding local economies, allowing people to put their money to work locally to make something happen. And this building is probably about 5 minutes walk, I think, that way. And this is now a hotel, but it was the Manchester Stock Exchange. It was in its last iteration the Northern Stock Exchange, and it shut down in 2000. So quite recently in the UK, we had regional stock markets, bond markets. There used to be 26 of these all across the country, where local businesses, projects, sometimes councils, raise money from the people that maybe worked in those businesses or used the services of those businesses. And that connection between your money and making things happen is quite powerful. You're going to look at a business, you're going to treat something that you're using differently if you are connected to it directly through your money. And that's at the heart of crowdfunding. It's trying to rebuild that connection and through that create a sort of a virtuous sort of circle. I think this, for everybody here is quite simple. Climate, the other big sort of aspect of what we're focused on, and especially in the context of the council work we do, we're now at a position where 80% of UK councils have declared climate emergencies. That is a really simple thing for them to do. They've rushed that through, and as we were just hearing earlier, the really difficult, complex stuff is now being done to try and work out actually what projects they do, and I think we've already just heard how difficult that is for them to start to move to action. Just another slide, just to give a little bit of context. With a lot of people sort of think, okay, actually we've got people with money living in communities, but maybe there's not that money that actually could be deployed to sort of be invested locally. And the amount of wealth across the UK is staggering. So, per 100,000 people, there is 4 billion of savings and investment on average across the UK. Obviously, South East is skewed to more of that wealth, but even if that bounces around between 3 and 5 billion, it's a lot of money. Not all of that money is going to be looking to sort of invest in local council or local projects. but currently zero pretty much is. Most of that money flows straight out of communities and out into the wider world. But what we know from all the work we've done and all the research we've done over the years, and a lot of the research that was done with the University of Leeds through the Financing for Society project, shows that people really want to put their money to work in their communities to help rebuild them. And if you go back, as that first slide with the Manchester Stock Exchange shows, but back to the days of building societies that were local, or councils historically used to raise money from their citizens. People used to do this, and there is a desire to do it. And as we're starting to show now with the local climate bonds and the work we've done with various councils now across the UK, really good things happen when people, rather than institutions, become the lenders to things in their community. So the first council we worked with was West Berkshire, and Joseph, who's the finance director there, is speaking in a bit, so I'm not going to say too much about the detail there. We've also worked with Islington and Warrington, and more recently Telford and Cotswold Council, and there's various other councils that are now looking to issue these instruments. So essentially what we're trying to do in very simple terms here is provide an alternative place that councils can go and borrow money for them to use us and borrow from their residents. The number one thing is it has to be cheaper than their other sources of borrowing. Otherwise, we're increasing the costs for the council, and that's regressive, because inevitably in the UK, only 50% of people in a community have money that they can save and invest. So if they're going to get involved and earn a return from their council, it has to be for the benefit of the community as a whole, and therefore it has to be cheaper. So that's the sort of starting point. And then it has to be efficient, and that's where the use of a crowdfunding platform, which allows electronic administration, makes it efficient for the council to use, and that in turn sort of saves money. This is just an example of an offer document, the sort of communication for Islington, one of the recent councils we work with. So I think what I'll talk a little bit about, because I think Joseph maybe talk more about things from the council perspective, is it's all well and good just raising money and it being cheaper for the council, but what we're interested in at Abundance, and what the project with the University of Leeds was about, is there some extra benefit here that is created? What's the social value of trying to bring the public back into the financing of their local authority? And obviously, starting point, there is an engagement, a communication benefit. And one of the ways I sort of maybe try and explain this is, it's great if a council sort of retrofits a building. That's wonderful, they've made it net zero. But if they don't tell people about that, half the impact is lost, because one of the big challenges we have in terms of getting regional decarbonisation is bringing all people, organisations with us. And a lot of the decarbonisation agenda is about people adopting new technologies and being confident to adopt new technologies, being aware that new technologies are available to adopt. So an obvious example is EV charging. If a council rolls out EV charging infrastructure, if nobody hears about that, no one's going to use it. And it's fine for a council to put out a press release saying it's done, but actually, the more communication tools you have available to you, the more likely that people will hear about it. And if you've got investors who are investing to make it happen, you're able to talk to them every 6 months when you pay them interest, and keep expanding the story about why you're doing stuff, keeping them aware, and those people talk to people, and it's just a different way of getting the message out. But it's also about trust. We know when you're trying to get people to work together to do things, trust is fundamental, and one of the big issues I suppose we've got globally at the moment is the breakdown in trust between institutions that serve us and people, and that trust often just comes from lack of communication points and lack of transparency. Just going back to how I used to get my parking permit back in the day, I used to walk into the council building and you'd see communication from the council. Now you just do it online in a couple of seconds. Councils have lost so many of their touch points with their citizens. So in that context, local climate bonds are quite a simple way to just start connecting with a certain section of the population, but a section of the population. What we're then also seeing is that, and this came out of a focus group in Warrington we ran as part of the Financing for Society project, a lady in the focus group said, "This is great, I understand lending my money to the council is a low risk, sort of savings investment product. I like my council, I like climate action, so rather than just taking the interest, can I donate the interest back to the council so they can do more good stuff? And so that's very weird, that's not a savings or investment product we've ever heard of, but we tested that idea more broadly. I found that actually lots of people want to help their councils do more than they currently do through their council tax. So we've put in place this mechanism for people to donate interest back, and so far roughly 10% of the interest that's been paid out has been paid straight back to the council to do other good things. And I suppose we're still at the very early days of this sort of new way of doing things, but my hope is that 5-10 years down the line, in a way, well, hopefully we don't have another big crisis, but if we do have another big crisis, will we be in a position where residents who maybe are doing financially better than others, will they be happy to donate large chunks of their interest at times of crisis in the same way we gave lots of money to the NHS during COVID? And I think, the evidence we've got so far is that yes, so this sort of people-led finance rather than institutional finance, people value things beyond the financial return. They value the integrity of their community, the sort of the well-being of the population more generally, of people who live around them. An institution who's lending is only ever going to be interested in getting their interest back and the bottom line. So that people dimension adds a resilience in a way if finance is being sourced from residents to a council's funding plans. And then finally there's sort of local economic benefits that obviously come if you're keeping money circulating locally. So that's sort of, I suppose, with this idea of local climate bonds, what we're really interested in, and there's ongoing work, again with the University of Leeds, to look at these social outcomes and see how we can improve them, ensure that they sort of happen at bigger scale, and what little triggers and nudges we can put into the overall process to enhance things. The last bit I just want to talk about is something, it's different to the local climate bonds. It's a different way of bringing residents into the funding of the public realm. What I've just spoken about is councils directly borrowing money. It's where councils are owning and developing infrastructure, but a lot of the net zero infrastructure and infrastructure more broadly in the UK is funded through, the word public-private partnership is politically unacceptable now. It's not used, but that sort of model is still used in different iterations. And Bristol City Council recently procured a private sector consortium to oversee the decarbonisation of the city as a whole over a 20-year contract. And this is, again, a sort of first, I think, probably globally, but certainly in the UK, where within that procurement they said, actually, we don't want the finance just to come from California Teachers Pension Fund. We want it to come from people of Bristol. We want people in Bristol to be directly invested in individual projects, whether that's EV charging, so building them into that solution. So the consortium that won, it's two firms, Vattenfall and Ameresco, which are global energy infrastructure firms. They sort of brought us into the consortium to provide that local financing aspect. So the idea out of this is that we'll create a Bristol green ISA where Bristol residents invest into the decarbonisation of their city and become stakeholders in this change. So slightly different model because it's this sort of private sector procured solution against local climate bonds, but it's the same sort of idea that we're bringing the public in because of these wider engagement benefits. So that's the end. Thank you. Who have to close this?
That was really interesting. Thank you so much, Karl. I think it was very interesting how you spoke about the idea of local climate bonds and using it as a crowdfunding platform, but also this idea of social value creation as well, and how we can try and get social outcomes from place-based economic investment. So finally, we have Joseph Holmes from West Berkshire Council. Hopefully Joseph will be on the line and he can start presenting to us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Jason.
Hello, yes, you can. Excellent. Okay, I'll have to do a bit of next slide in a minute, but I am talking to you from a dining room. It's not my own dining room, though. Katy talked about some of the oddities of local government, and here at West Berkshire, we happen to own a Grade 1 Elizabethan manor. So I'm talking to you from the Chandos dining room, not my own one. It's a nice chandelier behind me. So I'll talk a bit about our community bond that we issued with Abundance. And just go to the next slide, please. I'll just try and show you where West Berkshire is. Oh, if someone can move the slide on. Thanks. West Berkshire, we are it's an area, so the west of Reading, and sort of east of Swindon in the south of England. About 70% of the district is an area of outstanding natural beauty, with a variety of market towns, including Newbury as our main base. But an area where we declared a climate emergency back in 2019, and quite a strong focus on wanting to get to net zero by 2030. Okay, next slide. So I'll just talk to you a bit about why we did this. So the PWLB, that's the Public Works Loans Board, it's where we borrow money from, it's a subsidiary of the Treasury, and it's where most local authorities borrow for capital purposes. We can use the private sector or even issue larger institutional bonds ourselves, but most authorities will go through the PWLB, and that's where we've undertaken all of our borrowing. But the levels are set by central government. And when we're thinking of, should we issue our local climate bond, you can see there on the left-hand side of things, the government arbitrarily put the rate that we can borrow up by about 100 basis points, which is an extra 1%, which is quite a significant jump on borrowing. We've got an underlying need to borrow over £100 million over the next 5 years, so an extra percentage point on that is pretty significant for our budget. You can see then, just over a year later, they actually dropped the rate back down again, but as Chief Finance Officer, it's really important for me to have some certainty over what our borrowing rate is going to be. And especially when you're talking about some of the schemes to help us get to net zero, they're very long term, they take a lot of planning, they're often new. For example, we have a solar farm which is currently in for planning at the moment, but we've been preparing that business case for well over a year. It's going to take a lot longer to develop that through as well. So having some certainty over finance is really important. So Katy alluded to it earlier around some of those difficulties in trying to secure funding for business cases, and uncertainty of funding is certainly funding rate is one of those. So by being able to issue our own bond, that gives us a much greater level of certainty for forward funding some of our capital schemes. We'll go to next slide. So what we actually did is, as Karl set out, we worked with Abundance so that local residents, and indeed residents across the whole of the UK, could invest for as little as £5 in a range of different schemes that we have across the council. I'll come on to some of those schemes a little bit later on, but they're all part of our environment strategy, and we wanted to raise a bond of £1 million. We were one of the pilot authorities with a few others, and as Karl said, we got some external funding to help provide some of the due diligence work as part of that. Okay, next slide. So what it involved was launching that bond in July. We wanted to get to the £1 million, so we gave ourselves 3 months to do that. We certainly got a lot of interest nationally and locally. That's a picture of my finance portfolio holder, Ross. He had only been a sort of member of the executive for a few months. He'd only been a local councillor for less than a year, and already he got his picture in the Times. I think he had a totally sort of deluded view as to what being a local politician was necessarily about, but it certainly got a lot of national and local attention, which was really good. A lot of interest, a lot of people keen to see what it could do and how it might be different. And similarly within local authorities, lots of other councils have contacted me to find out how it works. And communications was a really important part of this. It was a shame that we launched just after the pandemic started, so we couldn't get out to meet as many of our residents as ideally we'd like to. We have a number of town and parish councils across our area, and also just communities that we want to speak with, but given it was right in the middle of the pandemic, that was very hard to do. So everything, unfortunately, was online mainly. But that didn't dent enthusiasm for actually raising the capital as we expected. So we managed to get to the £1 million just a couple of weeks before we expected to, which was really positive and showed that even for the first one, and at that time it wasn't ISA applicable, even for the first bond, it meant there was a sort of groundswell of interest in what we were doing. Okay, next slide. So here's some of the sort of schemes that we used the fund for, and it was really important for me as sort of the Chief Finance Officer. These were schemes that we were going to do. Interestingly, when we launched the bond, individuals would come forward and say, "Hey, you should spend it on this scheme or that scheme." Some of the things perhaps they would really like to see, like a solar farm, or perhaps generating power through water, or a variety of things. But it was really important for me that these were projects that we were going to deliver. So half of it went on some solar PV schemes across the council's estate, including schools and leisure centres and the council's own offices. And then we spent it on a variety of other smaller schemes, the things that people would notice, so footpaths, active travel schemes, which we mentioned beforehand, and then using tree planting as part of some of our flooding defence measures as well. And I think what was really interesting about this, and as part of an investment, means that anybody who invested in this can actually see the difference their investment has made, whereas for most things that people will be investing in, they just go into a very large pot. Certainly anyone who has an ISA, or if you invest with the government's green bond scheme, though obviously it's clearly doing things which are helping to get to net zero, you don't know exactly where those investments are going, whereas as part of our issuance, you can go along and you can see some of the changes that have been made because of the money that you have put in for us. And what was really important for us was that we made a saving against our prevailing Public Works Loan Board rate. So when we launched, that rate was 1.9%, we launched at 1.2%. So we made, on £1 million, about a £15,000 saving, which if you scale that up for all of our £100 million worth of borrowing, if we did all of that through the bonds and all of that on a similar level of saving, you're into the £1 million plus on saving, which is very substantial. Now, we probably would never do it through issuing bonds, but it does show that even if, as a local resident, you are not interested in getting to net zero whatsoever, this does save the council money, and I don't think there are many people who disagree with the council saving money on things at all. Okay, next slide. You might not be able to see this too well, but this just shows where some of the investors came from and where they invested. So just under a quarter of the total investment was raised by local residents. However, they represented only about 11 or 12% of the actual investors, so still the largest amount. But what it showed was that if you were local, you were investing over twice as much money as if you were investing from outside of the area. And where that was really helpful is from our communication side of things, is that we could get that message across. So that was really interesting, that balance we had there. As Karl said, the minimum you can invest is £5, and actually the split on some of the levels that people invested was very interesting. So around about a quarter of people invested between £5 and £100. So there was a real spread on how much people were putting in. At 1.2% return, nobody is going to get rich very quickly with this scheme. But I think as the bond issue progressed, people saw that it was a really positive environmental, social and governance investment that they could make. I think hence why there was a lot of investment from across the UK as a whole. Okay, next slide. And then some of the things that actually happened. So here's some nice pictures of some sort of flood alleviation and some solar PV schemes, which we do have up and running at the moment. But I think if you just go to the next slide, the thing that I found really beneficial from this was on the donation aspect. So Karl said that a number of people donated. So the first time that we put just a bit of blurb in with our update after 6 months, we just said to people if they want to, you can donate. We did not push it massively at all. 1 in 6 investors actually gave their money back to us. Now, at 1.2%, as I said, it's not going to be millions of pounds coming back. But I thought that was really significant, that people who were interested in the story that we had to tell, and that gave a real sort of additionality from this, which is sort of very rare to have as part of a scheme, that people actively give you more or give you their money for no return whatsoever, just because they think it's a good thing. So we used that money to spend on our wildflower verges project. So we've got a range of those across the district for anyone who is in West Park, so you'll notice that. But we got some extra sort of heritage wildflower seeds to put there, and at the moment it's looking absolutely fantastic. And indeed, from that additionality side of things, I would never have thought that I would have jumped off my bike on the way into work, walked it across to the middle of a roundabout and stood in the middle of a wildflower meadow in the middle of a roundabout, just because it looked really nice and was very peaceful. So there are some things that this can do. I can't say that all 160,000 of our residents necessarily are currently standing in the middle of a wildflower meadow, but it has certainly made a difference to how the area looks. So should we go to the final slide? And I think the other crucial thing for me as well, that there was a legacy from this. So there's loads of really interesting things that we do as local authorities across the whole range of services that we provide, but often they are very local, and they may exist in a specific time for a specific project. However, we are one of 6 now authorities who have utilised this. So it's really positive to see other local authorities pick this up and use this tool as a way to not only raise finance, it has to be cheaper than PWLB rate, but also that ability to communicate back to those investors what we are doing around net zero. It gives us a really important tool to start having that conversation with 640 people that we otherwise wouldn't be able to talk to and try and explain what we're doing. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Joseph. I think that's really interesting to see what you're doing in practice within the council, because it's all very well us talking about climate emergencies, as you said, Karl, but we need to really figure out how we're going to implement this in practice as well. Okay, so I'd like to invite Katy and Karl up and to sit on the stools, and hopefully we can get Joseph on the screen and we can begin our panel question and answer session.
So you can do it
Yeah,
through.
absolutely.
Okay.
Right, sorry, I'm just trying to get the questions up. Thank you. And just to remind you all, if you have a look on the questions and you see one that you particularly like, you can click the thumbs up button and that will allow you to vote on your favourite. Okay, so I think I'm just going to go through these systematically. First question, and I'll present this to all of you. Is there a danger that local authorities in wealthier areas will get an advantage over those in less privileged areas? And I think I'll pose that one to Katy first.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to reflect on which local authorities have gone for climate bonds, and there's a real balance between. But I think the challenge can be this takes this kind of work of thinking, of coming up with new forms of finance, new ways of making decisions, is very resource intensive, and it can be very hard for local authorities, local government more generally, to get money to do the thinking work. The local transport authority I was working with said that you can't get money to do this kind of intensive thinking, and that is a real problem, particularly in the less resourced councils. So I live in Bradford, and Bradford has some major issues that are, not decarbonisation related, that they're struggling with as well. So they don't really have time to think about this kind of thing. So I think, yes, there is a real danger. particularly the less wealthy councils, the councils with other significant issues of deprivation of health, that these become secondary and they don't get the time to think. So that I think there definitely needs to be a shift to allow funding to think, to try, to experiment. Otherwise, that's going to be exacerbated further. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Karl, did you have anything else to add to that?
I think just building on that, because this would have only happened because there was that funding to support that early stage experimentation. You know, we had to develop the legal contracts, we had to develop, I suppose, trust with the likes of Joseph, I know, who had many sleepless nights wondering, as he often says, whether I'd run away with all the money. So there's, you know, a huge risk for local authorities when they do something new, and that needs to be backed for them to take those steps. I think, you know, in the context of local climate bonds now, the model is established, and the council's now doing it and not relying on any external legal support. It's you know, the template is there. So it can start to be rolled out to councils across the country, and we're seeing that happen. And then, as we also saw from Joseph's slide, people, you know, don't just invest into their own council if they live there. They do invest into councils that are doing good stuff, and actually there's lots of different motivations for people to support, say, councils such as, you know, Bradford or sort of Warrington or Telford, who maybe wouldn't have been first on the list as councils that people would have thought about doing this from my perspective. So, yeah, I think.
Great, thank you. And Joseph, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? Is there a danger that local authorities in wealthier areas will get an advantage over those in less privileged areas? I think you said that there's now 1 in 6 local or you're the first out of 6 local authorities who have done this. So, yeah, do you have anything to say on that respect?
Yeah, and I to agree with Karl's comments. Yeah, we are 1 of 6 now, and there have been quite a spread of areas across the country who have issued a bond. I think they're more widely around this point. So as a sort of chief finance officer, so dear to my heart is all of the different priorities that we have to weigh up. You know, we've got massive changes to adult social care reform, for example, next year. So what happens with, you know, us all trying to get to net zero as well against that challenge and everything else that we have is really crucial, and that's where, you know, local priorities as set by sort of local politicians come into play. But the idea of some of that funding to go in to help support us in this way, so being part of the pilot, you know, we received £20,000, it's not a huge amount of money, but it was enough to make sure that we do all of that due diligence work, and then get this over the line so that it's a template for other people was really, really crucial. So that gave us the opportunity to have a bit of a think about this. Whereas I think, to be fair, if that money hadn't been there, we may well not have done this because the risk may well have been too great.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here about, do people who invest get an input or vote on what kind of green projects that are funded by the local authority? And I think this is quite a good practical question, and it also relates to what Katy was saying about participation. So perhaps, Joseph, if you'd like to answer that one first.
Yeah, I will. So no, they don't get a say, but it is a really good question, and it's a really good one to think about, you know, for us to think about in the future, because when we did launch this, we did have a number of residents and groups of residents who form action networks saying, hey, like, yeah, why don't we do this, why don't we do that instead? And the real challenge we have, it comes back to sort of Katy's points at the start, is around the governance on this, because if you know, the idea is go and build a wind farm, we're like, great, okay, let's go and build a wind farm. Right, that's going to take me a little bit of time to do. So what I don't need to do is take your money and then say, yeah, I'll build a wind farm, and then it never happens. And then I'll say, you didn't give me that money for the wind farm. Well, I didn't have to, so I spent it something else. So it's something about that we have to make sure the projects are deliverable. And I think that's where the donation side of things came in, even though it wasn't a huge amount of money, it does give us a bit more latitude around what we might do with that. So we've said for the next year to investors, what do you think if we use this to help our schools all become eco schools, and some of the workers as part of that. So I think that enables us to have a bit of a conversation around where this might go. But we are in a bit of a trap on the government side of this, between making sure that this goes towards schemes which are deliverable and can actually happen, because that would be the worst thing, is if we take people, the public's money, we don't actually deliver anything off the back of it. But the idea of us, once we know those schemes, providing something back to potential investors, I think is a really interesting one.
Great, thank you for that, Joseph.
Could I just come in on that as well? Because it's a point I feel really strongly about in a way, because I think local authorities have a governance process. They've got democratically elected councillors who are there to implement a manifesto, and then a governance process to work through the projects. And inevitably the people who are investing are going to represent the wealthiest, maybe 10, 15, 20% of the community, and therefore giving them additional control. I think there's a real question there. I think getting people to participate in the decisions about how we reach net zero is really important, but that maybe needs to be done through a mechanism such as citizen juries, which West Berkshire have done a lot of engagement work. So they've got that community and a broad section of the community thinking and engaging in the climate agenda, which is critical. We need ownership of it. But yes, I think we need to be very careful about giving control to the people who are investing, or any additional control to them. Donation is, as Joseph said, the way that they can exert a little bit of control. They can donate some money to a good cause, and that's great. But yeah, selecting projects, I think, is a dangerous area to go into. Great,
thank you. Given the cost of living crisis, do you think that there's a problem maybe with people wanting to invest later on down the line? Do you think, earlier on you said that you were quite surprised that people might want to invest, say, £5. One could expect that some people won't have that spare change in their pocket to invest in local communities.
I think inevitably the sections of the community that are going to be doing this at scale, they're getting wealthier, so they're not feeling the cost of living crisis in the same way. So I think inevitably it has some effect. I think the biggest effect for us at the moment in terms of getting people to sort of invest is that interest rates are bouncing around all over the place. So committing to a low interest rate product when you don't know whether interest rates are going to jump up in 6 months' time, it's a bit of that's our main challenge in terms of scaling things at the moment. Once interest rates stabilise, or there's a perception they might be dropping, that will be again another positive point. But we are in quite a state of flux. So when West Berkshire, Warrington, Islington went out, actually there was quite a lot of stability still in interest rate expectations, so people were able to make a fairly long-term investment decision, saving decision, and feel confident around it. But this year has been different. So I suppose that's the bit that holds, is more of a risk at the moment, not so much the cost of living crisis for us.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we've spoken quite a lot about crowdfunding, but I think the whole point of this this panel was to kind of talk about the role of the public sector in decarbonisation. So there's a question here for Katy, but I think Karl and Joseph, you can also answer this. Who do you think should be responsible for instigating the change in local authority system that you argue? So Katy, do you want to start first?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think I'm going to give a very academic question. Is from all places, because there has to be. We've got really good examples here of local authorities who have just pushed against the system. They've gone against the norm and set the precedent. But we also do need sort of top-down change in the incentives that come, the funding for the thinking work, and the enabling, the more consistent funding side of things, and just more consistency on the tools and guidance. So central government does have quite good guidance on futures thinking. it's just not necessarily on very clear about what it's for, where it could be used, where it's not appropriate. So they've sort of gone part the way to providing some good guidance, but not really far enough that it's become embedded. And setting the expectations that when cases are put forward, perhaps for central government funding, that actually that guidance
Recording
is used.
in progress.
Oh, hello. So they could become more connected, so actually enable the bottom-up work to happen. So they've got the guidance, they don't insist on it being used when cases are being put forward. And the way that they send out requests for grant funding at very short notice doesn't allow the thinking to happen. So it's something institutionally that's not happening at the national level, of the way that not just the type of funding, but the way that funding is disseminated, very short notice, very quick turnaround, very directed towards certain topics. So there's a sort of a definite need for a rethink of how decision making is encouraged from national level down, but also that there is a need for local governance to change to enable these methods. So there's no sort of strict, rigid forms of making decisions in local government. It's, you know, there's elected panels, they ask for information in certain ways. It's only when they interact with national government for funding there's strict forms of making decisions. So there are other ways of getting funding, but they're taking the sort of strict guidance from government and applying it to all things in some circumstances. So I think we've seen some real examples where that hasn't happened. We've seen innovative forms of finance which have enabled different ways of more strategic thinking, taking something from a strategy, having a pipeline of projects and delivering. So it is possible. So there's something about sort of the culture of local government that needs to be enabled to change, both by the action locally but also nationally. A lot to be done.
Great, thank you for that. Joseph or Karl?
Sorry, we have a role as well. So we are all citizens and we can all, you know, push for these things to happen. So I can ask Bradford why they haven't got a local municipal bond, for example. I can push my sort of local representatives. So yeah, we have a role too.
Great, thank you. Joseph, did you have anything to add? There's also a question here whether local authorities should have statutory duties to get involved in these kinds of schemes. So perhaps you could speak a little bit about that, your thoughts on that, and also who you think should be responsible for kind of instigating the change.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point that Katy just made then. Everyone has the ability that they can ask questions. So our council, for example, you ask public questions, our executive or our full council around this agenda. And indeed we do have many questions around net zero and a whole range of different things that we may or may not be doing that our local residents want. I think on the statutory duty, that's what I think is really interesting to work in the sector is around net zero. Lots of the public went to central government and said, like, you know, we want this, we like this, and perhaps they didn't get the answer they want. So then turned their attention to local authorities, and my previous and current council had varieties of protests which took place, which led to then many local authorities declaring a climate emergency. It's the only thing as authorities generally which we've never declared an emergency about. You know, we have a whole range of pressures and sort of real, you know, huge policy issues around, you know, transport, social care, education, and a variety of other services that we run. But this was one of the sort of first times that we had some cohesion around many places declaring emergency and declaring net zero goals. So, and that was all achieved without any statute or you know, processes going through central government, which would take an awful lot longer. And I think actually the time this has taken to really have quite a significant shift in a number of local authorities has been far faster than if we'd been mandated to do something centrally. It was raised earlier, the different funding pots that we have to apply for and how some of those schemes are assessed. Certainly post-pandemic, one thing I'm noticing is there are far more central government bidding schemes that we can go in for. But each of those require resource, time, and then having to weigh up, you know, if we bid for this, how much resource is that going to take against bidding for something else, which we might get more money for, or it might be easier to do. So all of that has to get balanced out. So actually, I think some of this around taking local action is actually what's going to probably drive change faster than if we all keep waiting for somebody else to tell us to do something.
Great, thank you. And Karl, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think it's all been said. I suppose just listening to Joseph there, and I think amazing sort of seeing councils once the climate emergency is declared, the sort of energy that gave the council as a whole, and the license to teams to think differently, which was brilliant. I think we have a risk. Unfortunately, the climate movement for ahead of a long time now. So I saw the last big wave, 2008. And then it gradually, that energy sort of dissipate. And I think with all the different things that are going on in the world at the moment, we have a risk that we start to lose some of that momentum again. I don't think it'll go quite back down to where it was last decade, but we have a risk, and it's how do we keep things energised so that we keep that momentum, keep building momentum, because we don't have a decade to spare this time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. I guess that there's a couple of questions here about capacity within local authorities. We all know that local authorities are lacking resources. Do you have any thoughts on whether we should be focusing on capacity building in local authorities, or should we be developing new institutions to support them? Perhaps Katy, I could pose that question to you first.
Yeah, it's very alluring to have new institutions doing work on behalf of local authorities where we get efficiency. But I think we've seen that before, and that there's been a real hollowing out of local authorities and the skills and just the number of staff there, that it forces them then to have to, so a lot of the work of scenario planning of this more complex decision making is done by consultants, and then they're expected to understand the culture of the local authority. They're expected to automatically then be able to be delivered, and I think there is a risk to any further outsourcing. So I think there's a balance between efficiency of bringing sort of scale to these things, and just the need to stop hollowing out local authorities and actually re-skill the very skilled people, to re-resource and enable them to have the time to do this kind of work. And maybe there is a bit of reskilling for new methods, but I think I've been working with the public sector for nearly 20 years now, and just seen a continual depletion of the time available and the number of staff available, and that isn't beneficial. I used to be a consultant, so I was one of these people that was outsourced too, so I probably shouldn't complain. But there's definitely a balance, and I think that's a real challenge, a real line to be trod, of balancing efficiency and real resourcing of local government.
Thank you. And Karl, do you have anything to add?
I think, it's interesting to hear Joseph's thoughts. I think there, on the net zero side, there are some, there's a lot of what one council does to another council. It is the same. There's EV charging rollout, for instance. There's probably 3-4 different models. That this can be templated, and one council can learn from another. So I think there is some really good work happening, and Joseph might be able to talk a bit more specifically on this, around centralising some of this resource so that different councils can draw on it. And there's the Energy Catapult, Net Zero Go platform, which is consolidating sort of templates and approaches for doing different technologies. You've got the energy hubs, which are sort of central resources that councils can draw on. But I think you still have an issue within this council. Do they have the resources to go to the resources?
Yeah.
Which is a bigger challenge. But
if it's all right, I'm going to disagree with you there, Karl. Because not for more resources. Our council has actively put additional resources into our environment team to deliver our environment strategy, and that was a proactive prioritisation, and plenty of other areas that we could have spent the money on, but that's where locally politicians want to spend the money. But on the centralisation, the bit that I disagree is that, we've all got to put EV charging and other bits and lots of bits and bobs in. But if you look at our challenge to get to net zero, that's totally different to Manchester's challenge to get to net zero. We're a really rural authority, so that you could just take EV charging. That network is totally different across the whole of the country, and that's where I think great, put a new body in, but unless it's going to seriously help us support resources, you run the risk, as we articulated before, that it's like another hoop that you have to jump through. There are over 300 councils around the country who all have a really different challenge. We have a lot of very nice chalk water streams running through the district, so our risk from flooding through those is really, really different to authorities. We don't have a coast, for example, here in West Berkshire. That impact and that local challenge is really different, and I think that's where we can really energise our residents as well, because they can then see that there's some much more sort of hyper-local schemes happening, which will be of greater interest, and then that's good as well, because you're engaging more and more of the population in trying to solve these problems, because none of us humans are good-hearted, not going to do it on our own at all.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of the session today. Please join me in thanking Katy, Karl and Joseph in their contributions. It's been really, really fascinating. I've enjoyed it loads, and I hope you have as well. So, yeah, thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.